Welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Death Knight. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. The Death Knight takes up page 47 of the Monster Manual, and its lore goes as follows. When a paladin that falls from grace dies without seeking atonement, dark powers can transform the once mortal knight into a hateful undead creature. A Death Knight is a skeletal warrior clad in fearsome plate armor. Beneath its helmet, one can see the knight's skull with malevolent pinpoints of light burning in its eye sockets. Eldritch Power. The Death Knight retains the ability to cast divine spells. However, no Death Knight can use its magic to heal. A Death Knight also attracts and commands lesser undead, although Death Knights that serve powerful fiends might have fiendish followers instead. Death Knights often use warhorse skeletons and nightmares as mounts. Immortal until redeemed. A Death Knight can arise anew even after it has been destroyed. Only when it atones for a life of wickedness or finds redemption can it finally escape its undead purgatory and truly perish. And that's all there is when it comes to the general lore of the Death Knight. So I think that's pretty cool. There's a lot there that we can work with and develop around. And there also seems to be a little blurb or block of flavor text in regards to the Death Knight. And it reads as follows. Lord Soth. Lord Soth began his fall from grace with an act of heroism, saving an elf named Isolde from an ogre. Soth and Isolde fell in love, but Soth was already married. He had a servant dispose of his wife and was charged with murder, but fled with Isolde. When his castle fell under siege, he prayed for guidance and was told that he must atone for his misdeeds by completing a quest, but growing fears about Isolde's fidelity caused him to abandon his quest. Because his mission was not accomplished, a great cataclysm swept the land. When Isolde gave birth to a son, Soth refused to believe that the child was his and slew them both. All were incinerated in a fire that swept through the castle, yet Soth would find no rest in death, becoming a Death Knight. So that's pretty cool. It's an interesting little tale of lore there about a specific individual who became a Death Knight, Lord Soth. So Lord Soth, for those of you who don't know, is sort of the quintessential Death Knight, and his depiction is what's illustrated in the Monster Manual itself for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I believe he first appeared in Dragonlance, and then later on he can be found in the Ravenloft series. But Lord Soth is kind of the quintessential Death Knight of the D&D world, if you would. But without further ado, let's jump into the stat block, shall we? The Death Knight is a medium undead creature with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 20, which is plate armor and a shield. It has hit points that average 180 or 19d8 plus 95, and it has a movement speed of 30 feet. The Death Knight has a strength of 20, a dexterity of 11, a constitution of 20, an intelligence of 12, a wisdom of 16, and a charisma of 18. The Death Knight's saving throws include dexterity plus 6, wisdom plus 9, and charisma plus 10. It is immune to necrotic and poison damage, and it is immune to the exhausted, frightened, and poisoned conditions. The Death Knight has the sense of dark vision for 120 feet and a passive perception of 13. The Death Knight can speak the languages of Abyssal and Common, and it is a challenge rating of 17. On to the abilities. Magic resistance. The Death Knight has advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. Martial Undead. Unless the Death Knight is incapacitated, it and undead creatures of its choice within 60 feet of it have advantage on saving throws against features that turn undead. Spellcasting. The Death Knight is a 19th level spellcaster. Its spellcasting ability is Charisma, with a spell save DC of 18, a plus 10 to hit with spell attacks. It has the following paladin spells prepared. At first level, with 4 slots, it has Command, Compelled Duel, and Searing Smite. At second level, with 3 slots, it has Hold Person and Magic Weapon. At 3rd level, with 3 slots, it has Dispel Magic and Elemental Weapon. At 4th level, with 3 slots, it has Banishment and Staggering Smite. And at 5th level, with 2 slots, it has Destructive Wave, which causes necrotic damage. On to the actions. Multi-attack. The Death Knight makes 3 longsword attacks. Longsword is a melee weapon attack with a plus 11 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 9 or 1d8 plus 5 slashing damage, or an average of 10 or 1d10 plus 5 slashing damage if used with 2 hands, plus an average of 18 or 4d8 necrotic damage. Hellfire Orb, which can be used once a day. The Death Knight hurls a magic ball of fire that explodes at a point it can see within 120 feet of it. Each creature in a 20-foot radius sphere centered on that point must make a DC 18 dexterity saving throw. The sphere spreads around corners. A creature takes an average of 35 or 10d6 fire damage and an average of 35 or 10d6 necrotic damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a successful one. Finally, the reaction. Parry. The Death Knight adds 6 to its AC against one melee attack that would hit it. To do so, the Death Knight must see the attacker and be wielding a melee weapon. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats of the Death Knight. So, as you can see, a pretty intense, heavy-hitting monster. Pretty cool creature to implement in a campaign or in an adventure. And I think that there's quite a few things that can be done to use the Death Knight as a compelling monster for your party. So without further ado, let's jump into some adventure crafting, shall we? So, first and foremost, the Death Knight is a pretty cool monster and pretty powerful and devastating just based on its stats and its abilities and stuff like that. So, cool thing is you probably wouldn't have to mutate or change too much of a Death Knight in order to fit your campaign or your adventure, though you most certainly could. And I have an idea that I think would be pretty interesting when implementing a Death Knight or Death Knights in your adventure or campaign for the players at your table. So, in terms of generating an adventure with a Death Knight, I would say that you'd probably want to hold off on using the Death Knight until the later levels, obviously, since the Death Knight is a challenge rating of 17. Pretty high up there in terms of the challenge scale for your players. But nonetheless, I think that it definitely could be possible to use a Death Knight in a lower level adventure. Namely, what I would do, say my players were half that, right? Like level 8, level 9, and I wanted them to encounter a Death Knight. What I would do is simply just cut the Death Knight's abilities and damage and health in half, pretty much, right? Instead of having a whole mess of spells, let's say, right? Like, for example, instead of having an AC of 20, perhaps it has an AC of 16 or 17 hit points. I would go from the 180 average down to 90. And same thing with the spell slots. I would give it 2 first level slots instead of 4, stuff like that. And I would also probably bring down the damage output by about half for a lower level party. But I think that there's a cool way that you could implement that for a lower level if you wanted to, by simply having a Death Knight who's in a weakened state for some reason or in some way. Perhaps the adventurers are traveling to some unknown ruin or uncharted territory that used to hold an ancient kingdom or an ancient castle, something to that effect. And there is a Death Knight who rules over the ruins of this kingdom or castle, and the party has to go there and dispense of it in order to free the land of the Death Knight's terror. Or perhaps there's a magical item or some form of artifact that's at that same location and the players require it for another interested party. Or perhaps there's a weapon of legendary lore that they need in order to take on the larger villain at the end of the campaign, though you would be pretty hard pressed to find a much larger, more challenging monster already outside of a Death Knight. But I think that a Death Knight could be a really cool monster to use at almost any level. And the reason why I'm suggesting a lower level sort of pared down version of the standard Death Knight is because upon looking at the Death Knight, reading the lore of the Death Knight, and just how gnarly and awesome the Death Knight is, in my opinion, what I could definitely see being done with the Death Knight is an entire campaign revolving around Death Knights, because Death Knights are one of the coolest monsters, and it's kind of a shame that they're sort of reserved for high-level play, though I understand entirely why they're reserved for high-level play, because they're these high-power, legendary monsters that are sort of fallen paladin warriors that kind of perpetually exist in this sort of purgatory that is the material realm, right? But I could see an entire campaign being set up where the adventurers are, let's say, the initiates or the new members of some form of guild or faction, right? And the guild or faction is effectively tasking them with perhaps bringing up the name and the reputation of the faction or of the guild and generating notoriety for it in terms of their deeds and stuff like that. And what you can do is you can have this faction or this guild be effectively tied to Death Knights in one way or the other. So as an example, what I'm thinking of is imagine like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but in a sort of deranged, perverted way, right? Or imagine something like Lord of the Rings, like the Kings of Men becoming the Nazgul, right? And perhaps this guild or faction that your players have initiated themselves into has set its goal to be the destruction of these Death Knights throughout the realm, throughout the land, in order to save the lands surrounding them from their corruption, to save the people of the neighboring cities or towns or kingdoms from being terrorized by these monstrous undead creatures. And you can generate a lot of juicy stuff there, a lot of juicy lore, and make a really cool setting, I think, for a campaign where perhaps the original founder of the faction that your party is a part of was one of those knights of high repute, of ancient time, of anything like that, and of the same order that this sort of group of Death Knights was a part of in life. And the founder of the guild is the one who turned their back to the group during the time of their corruption or of their destruction or conversion into the Death Knights that they now are. And I think that you can create a lot of pretty cool stuff in that way, where the Death Knight sort of plays a main role in the campaign. And you can have Death Knights set as the main bosses or main bad guys for your players to contend with as they're progressing through the rest of your campaign. Kind of gives you a consistent through line of main quests, if you would, while your players can also partake in side quests and other things like that in order to level up and make themselves a high enough level to perhaps contend with the final Death Knight who is at full power. You could even implement in that campaign certain tricks or puzzles or technologies or items or lore or passages or magic that needs to be used in order to weaken the Death Knights so that your players can stand a chance at competing with them. If you don't want to declaw the Death Knight as such, right? You can have all sorts of things that they can seek out in order to acquire and have on them so that when they do encounter a Death Knight, they're capable of diminishing its power. They're capable of diminishing its deadliness, its effectiveness at doing damage to them, and one-shotting them potentially, depending on what level they're at when they first encounter one. And I think that you can sort of seed your world with a bunch of cool side quests and adventures that involve acquiring perhaps objects of power or some lost knowledge or wisdom that allows them to have the capability of overtaking and overcoming the threat of the Death Knights. And in going this route with sort of this undead, villainous, inverse version of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table is you could effectively create a number of paladins as though you were generating PCs, as though you were generating player characters, scale them up to level 17 or even level 18 if you wanted to, and essentially just sort of change certain aspects of the Death Knight, right? You could go as simply as just changing the types of spells or abilities that the Death Knight has because of the oath that it took in life. You could change the weapons that they use. You could change the spells that they use. You can go a pretty long way, I think, when it comes to customizing and adjusting the Death Knight as a monster. And that would allow you to maintain some freshness, some flavor, change it up a bit, kind of keep your players on their toes as they're encountering these Death Knights. I mean, realistically, if you wanted to save the original Death Knight, let's say the one that's on the page for the final battle or the big bad evil guy encounter, you could do that, and then you could generate paladin player characters for yourself, for your players to contend against, and just change their status to being undead, make them evil, and you can adjust things accordingly, right? I think that there's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to the Death Knight, and you can create a pretty cool campaign entirely, I think, with Death Knights, right? And then when you change the abilities of the Death Knights, let's say, perhaps that gives you some inspiration or incentive to change the items that need to be used or acquired in order to overcome the Death Knights. Perhaps in the initial one, the founder or the faction holds an artifact in their storage room or in their vault that is an item that can weaken the power of the Death Knight so that they can be defeated. Perhaps it is something that allows the Death Knight to be defeated permanently, right? Because as the lore states, the Death Knight can never be truly destroyed until they atone for their misdeeds. And perhaps there's an item that the faction has, that the guild has hidden away somewhere, that allows them to supersede that aspect of the Death Knight and allows them to destroy the Death Knight outright without it having to necessarily atone and come to the realization of how monstrous the acts it did were. And that in and of itself perhaps could be the opening adventure for your campaign. That could be the acolytes or the initiates are seeking induction into this clan or this faction, and their task in order to be initiated into the guild is to go to the ancient ruins, the original ruined temple, let's say, of the guild founder and find their hidden missing artifact that could be used to defeat the Death Knights without having them come to see what they have done or come to terms with the evil that they propagated. And then in that, you could generate a nice little tidbit of lore that would be pretty cool. Why did this founder have this in their possession? Why did they own it? Did they make it? Was it given to them? How did they come about it? And it could be one of those things where perhaps the founder had it as sort of the kill switch, right? Perhaps the founder of the guild, who did not become a Death Knight, was given by the other Death Knights, was given something that would allow them to destroy the Death Knights if ever they got out of hand or succumbed to evil and destruction. Right? Perhaps this was a scenario sort of lichdom type thing, right? Imagine like a lich seeking immortality. Perhaps this circle of knights or this group of ancient knights that became the Death Knights were seeking out immortality and the ability to exist forever and maintain their legacy and their waking life as much as possible. But turns out there was some black magic involved, or it was a trick or a curse brought on by, who knows, perhaps there is or was a lich who sort of seeded the minds of the knights with these ideas or left breadcrumbs around for them to pick up and discover in order for them to follow this trail and find immortality, but they didn't realize it would be through undeath and they would be cursed to exist in this state of purgatory on the material physical plane. So going back to that first adventure, yeah, perhaps the item or the artifact that's lost in that ruined temple is a key to limiting the Death Knight's powers or limiting their capability of sort of remanifesting or regenerating themselves and returning after X amount of time, right? Perhaps it was created by the knight who founded the guild or faction that your players are a part of, just because when they realized what happened to their companions, they decided to create this item or this artifact or a spell or something like that, which will allow more mundane, less powerful creatures, let's say, to take on and hopefully overcome the capabilities of the Death Knight, right? And I mean, I think you could go a very, very long way with the Death Knight as sort of the focal point of your campaign or series of adventures. And I think that you could even flip it on its head if you wanted to. If you were doing an evil campaign, basically the founder of the faction or guild, let's say, that your players have become a part of is a Death Knight that perhaps wants to be the Death Knight rather than a Death Knight. Perhaps they're seeking the power of their rivals, perhaps in destroying the other Death Knights. The Death Knight that founded the guild that your players are a part of becomes more and more powerful. And then you could turn it on them and have them have to take on that Death Knight as sort of the final boss monster, if you would, because now that it's all powerful, it has no purpose in the faction, so, or in anything else in the world, really. So it wants to just destroy everything. I think you can develop quite a bit when it comes to using Death Knights as the focal point for a campaign. And I mean, you can also flip it the other way once again and go ultra valiant and heroic and noble, and perhaps the only way that the players can overcome and defeat the Death Knights is by getting them to atone for their sins and realize the sort of heinous, nefarious deeds that they had conducted. And in doing that, the Death Knights can finally rest, right? And I mean, obviously you can go other routes with the Death Knight in the way of just like having it as the monster of the week. You could create a Death Knight that is perhaps the guard or protector of some treasure. You could have a Death Knight that is perhaps the bodyguard or second in command of a much greater monster, which is, there's not too much there since the Death Knight is already a pretty high level monster, but you could go that way. You know, perhaps they're the second in command, like I said, of a lich or something like that. You know, you could go very Sauron with it, how Sauron has the Nazgul and the Death Knight sort of play the role of the Nazgul in your campaign. But I think that there's a lot that can be done with Death Knights in terms of using them as the focal point of your entire campaign. And if you do make it to level 20 with your players and have a high level campaign, still only need a couple of Death Knights, I think, and you have the potential to have a pretty awesome final battle, let's say, especially if you sort of mutate and adjust things here and there with the Death Knight by giving them each a little bit of flavor or a little bit of a unique flair to themselves. But I suppose if you wanted to go the route of the servant to a larger entity, you could go the way of perhaps the Death Knights or this corrupt King Arthur and Round Table of Knights now serves under a devil or a demon or some abyssal lord, something like that. And in order to prevent the abyssal lord, or have the means to prevent the abyssal lord to come into the material plane and destroy everything or take over or pull the material realm down to the 9 hells, whichever way you go, the Death Knights could all hold a part of the means to overcome the Lord. Right. So if you went the route of the corrupted knights, right, the knights that used to be valiant and noble, kind of stand puff-chested and prideful, sort of the classic heroic knight appearance or disposition, and they were doing everything that they could, let's say, to overcome a larger, more evil entity, perhaps before they were corrupted and turned into Death Knights, they were working towards having an item or a mechanism or a device or a spell or something like that in which they could destroy the demon lord or devil or lich or what have you, but perhaps they never got to finish it. And so now that's the impetus for the adventure or for the campaign for your players at the table, right? Is they have to finish what these knights started. But in order to get their feet wet and sort of get those first steps in, they have to go and collect the pieces of this item or of this thing from the Death Knights who still carry them on their person, right? And then you can implement things like Death Knights being defeated, and then, like I said, after X amount of days, it regenerates or remanifests itself. Perhaps now the Death Knights are sort of on a manhunt for the party, and the more Death Knights that they defeat and take these items from, the more Death Knights they have chasing them. So you can create something, I think, here that's really, really cool by using Death Knights, and something that'll keep your players interested and compelled to come back and want to see how the story develops, as well as make themselves more powerful and gain infamy and shinies and stuff like that. I think that it can make a very compelling narrative and through line for your campaign. But all in all, I think the Death Knight is a pretty awesome monster, and I would certainly use the Death Knight, and hopefully will certainly use the Death Knight as sort of the focal point of one of my campaigns, for sure. There's just too much to not do that. There's too much with the Death Knight, I think. For me, at least, there's too much that you can do with a Death Knight in terms of their abilities, their cool factor, their challenge rating, their abilities, their lore, their reason for existence. There's so many avenues that you can take, I think, to create a really compelling campaign using Death Knights. They're just too cool to not use. So hopefully the next time I get a campaign set up and established, that's going to be the starting point for my players at the table, because the Death Knight is just an awesome, awesome creature. Obviously legendary, has obviously made its way beyond just Dungeons and Dragons, but the Death Knight is one of those monsters that you don't just generate an adventure for, you generate a whole world around them and make them the main focus of your campaign. But that's all I got for you fine folks today when it comes to the Death Knight. I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please be sure to leave a review, leave a rating, stuff like that. It would certainly help me out, get some more ears and eyes on the podcast, help some more people out who are having some trouble coming up with ideas for their campaigns or adventures, and it would be pretty awesome. Also, if you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I would kindly ask that you like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that fun stuff, as it would help out to grow the channel and help to grow the podcast and all of those things, sort of get more eyes and ears on it and get more people playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, next week's episode, we'll be covering the Demi-Lich, another pretty powerful monster in the Monster Manual. Pretty cool, sort of a flaming skull type entity that you could definitely create an adventure for, probably once again create an entire campaign around, but we'll save that for next week. Just an ending footnote, perhaps the circle of Death Knights that your players are trying to overcome and defeat and stuff like that were compelled to their undeath by a Demi-Lich perhaps they found in a cave or some lost underground ancient ruin back in their time. But that's that for now. So, until next time, thank you all very much once again, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good day, everyone.